Hey,
Hey, we are live.
we are
Calling,
live.
calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London calling Rick Beyer in Chicago. How
I
are
am
you?
here, Chris. Greetings and welcome
Greetings
to
to you.
another edition of History Happy Hour.
Thank you.
Something occurred to me, Chris, that I wanted
And
to
what is
mention
that?
to you. Yeah. So, you know how every week when we're promoting this show, we say, we're so excited about this week's guest. And so
Yes.
people are probably thinking after a while, are they really that excited each time about this week's guest
Right.
or not? And, for me, the answer is always yes.
Yes.
I am very excited
That's why we
about.
asked him on the show.
Right, but I mean, every week it's exciting, and the topic is exciting, and the guest is exciting because that's what passes for excitement, at least here. And history is exciting, and so I'm excited to be here once again. And of course, we're here every Saturday, every Sunday. What day is it? We're here every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern on the Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages. And we're just waiting a moment for people to join us. And please sign in, say hello if you're here. And I think I see Marcus and Catherine and Jack and
Hey, Doreen.
Doreen, John, Duncan. So we have from Providence to Normandy to elsewhere, just among the people who've signed in here on Facebook. So I think we're just about ready to get rolling.
Is
Chris.
it that moment?
So it is that very special moment. If I can find the button, it will
Outstanding.
become that
Find the button.
moment.
Okay, good.
Here we go. And the bar
Bar
is
is
open.
open.
Yes, and do you want to introduce our guest and our topic today?
I do. Our guest this week is Harry Smee, and Harry Smee is the grandson of probably one of the most remarkable men I've read about in quite some time, a man named Frank Brock, who we should all know more about, and we will by the end of the show. And Harry wrote the book with Henry McCrory, and it's called Gunpowder and Glory, and we'll show you lots of wonderful graphics. And I want to say at the outset that I consider myself pretty well read about First World War, and this is a story that just totally passed me by until I got hold of this book, and it's an incredible story. So, Harry, I want to welcome you to the show, and thank you for coming on to talk about a pretty remarkable relation of yours.
Yeah, he was, isn't he?
He was.
I agree.
So, I just obviously I've mentioned that you're his grandson, so we don't have to ask the usual question about, what inspired you to write the book, but kind of what brought you to it. I mean, why did you decide to write about your grandfather?
Hmm. Well, in the 1980s, I went to work at Brock's Fireworks, by that stage in Scotland. And while I was there, I became much more aware of the extraordinary history of Brock's itself, how it had started in the 17th century. It had continued through to a notable day on the 5th of November, 1720, when John Brock, the founder, had gone to meet his maker, having blown himself up, I'm afraid. And so on it went through the centuries. And I turned up in the 1980s there, and I became very aware of the extraordinary story, and Frank's element as well, and I wanted to share that with people. I thought that his life was worth sharing and that people would be interested in it.
Well, so could Rick?
Sorry, I'm too busy muting myself to be able
Oh.
to ask a question. I want to echo, first of all, what Chris said. And there's so much about this story that I never heard of. And I think most of our audience will feel the same way and be fascinated to find out about. And I wish you could tell us just a little bit more before we get to Frank Brock's life about the Brock's fireworks, because I think that in the UK 150 years ago, if we said Brock's fireworks, everybody would know what we were talking about. But I can tell you in the US in 2020, I don't think anybody realizes the incredible nature of this firm and the innovators in fireworks and showmen on a grand scale, really,
Yes,
weren't they?
yes, they were. I mean, they did pretty well in the 18th century. So they were said to have inspired Handel in the London Pleasure Gardens, and Dr. Johnson was frustrated with them when bad weather put off the display he'd gone to watch, and he got a whole lot of young boys to cause a riot. Uh, and uh, and it's also possible that they helped with the fireworks for Marie Antoinette's wedding in 1770 at Versailles, because they worked very, very closely with a man called Torre, who was who got the contract at Versailles and who had pleasure gardens all over London and Europe. So we think that probably happened, but we're not 100% sure. Then into the 19th century, by the middle of the 19th century, they were gearing up. Fireworks had got into a difficult position, firstly because they'd been associated in the early part of the 19th century with prostitution. In the last throes of the pleasure gardens, as they were beginning to close down, prostitution was fairly rife there. And then secondly, at the end of the Crimea War, the British government spent a huge amount of money on firework displays, overspent all over Britain. And people went off fireworks. They'd been over fireworked. And then in 1865, Charles Brock, who was Frank's uncle and a brilliant man, he went to the directors of the Crystal Palace Company, the Crystal Palace, which had been built in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition of 1851, and then sold and moved to Crystal Palace in South London, Sydenham in South London, where it was rebuilt. And he went to see the directors, and he persuaded them to put on a firework competition. And they didn't want to do it. What happens if this goes wrong? What happens if the prostitutes come back and all this sort of stuff? So he said, no, it's going to be great. And he ran it. And it was very successful. So successful. And he so impressed them that they gave him a contract. And from then on, he ran displays right way through the summer season until the early autumn, around about now, the last display would have been. And then in 1870, he picked up a very big contract from Napoleon III to supply his armies, the French armies, with military pyrotechnics for his war with Bismarck. And that contract was so substantial that it allowed him to spread across the world. And he then set out. He had a factory in Constantinople. He moved into North America. He did that's the Brooklyn Bridge celebration in 1892, but he also did the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876, and Brock's was the first electric advertisement in the world. There's Philadelphia with George Washington. You see George Washington, I think that's probably the first firework portrait, because they hadn't introduced them widely until 1879 in the Crystal Palace. That's Philadelphia.
I just want to jump in to say, for somebody who's watching this and maybe not quite understanding the scale, that portrait of Washington done in fireworks is probably 60 feet high, if it's an inch, and some of these displays went on to be as an eighth of a mile or more in width. I mean, these are huge.
Yeah,
kind of,
it's a completely new
art
form.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have any cinema to go and look at the news, you certainly didn't have any television or anything like that. If something happened, such as the American victory in the Battle of Manila Bay in the late 1890s, 1898, I think, as soon as the war was announced, Arthur Brock, who was running it at that stage, set up all the carpenters and everybody that he needed. And as soon as he got back the information on the battle, the artists got to work and they created this massive set piece that would have had 7 or 8 miles of instantaneous fuse, tens of thousands of individual fireworks. It was set up over an eighth of a mile in width and about 100 feet, 80, 100 feet high. And it was, and that would have been the center of their display. And the artists who would have painted that, whether it was that or the Battle of Trafalgar, whatever it was, they would have painted a beautiful picture. And sometimes the Brocks used the best artists of the day. And then that own in-house art team would scale it onto these massive, great set pieces. So by the the 1890s, Brocks was not only the best known company in Britain, but it was also probably the best known company in North America, in Australia, in South Africa, all over the world.
I mean, you tell a wonderful story about them actually bringing a fireworks display, through the jungles in Africa for Queen Victoria. Was it Queen Victoria's?
Yeah, the Jubilees. Yeah. So Brocks worked their way into the diplomatic arrangements. And for example, if any big cheeses like the Kaiser or the Shah or the Tsar or the Sultan, any of those chaps came along to London, they'd be taken down to the Crystal Palace by the Prince of Wales, later to be Edward VII, and they themselves would fire their own portrait with an electric button, which was quite a new sort of fangled idea at the time. And whenever Victoria had a jubilee, 1887, 1897, or something like that, the fireworks were sent out all over the world. One of them went to Blantyre, which is the one you're talking about, what is now Malawi. It was, and of course in India, they did a lot in India. When there was a new coronation, wow, the Brocks were there, lots of teams. They'd be moving ahead of the prince. They'd be putting it so the prince would come into a new city, and the sky would light up with things which nobody had ever seen before. Right. So you can imagine, because these displays were breathtaking, and so I think that that was the sort of background into which Frank was born.
Well, I mean, in fact, the firm is so famous. There's a figure of speech, a British figure of speech, right? Could you tell?
Because what happened was when Charles negotiated his contract with the directors of the Crystal Palace, that what they did was they agreed that once a year he would get a Brocks benefit display where all the gate money went to him. So what they did was they kept all the rejects. So all the stuff that didn't pass the quality control test during the year were kept back to add to the display. So Brocks benefit was massive. All the leading newspapers, the Times, the Morning Chronicle, everybody would send down correspondence to the Crystal Palace, and they would review the Brocks benefit display and write about it. And the Brocks benefit display became well known all over the world. And then the word Brocks benefit entered the English language to mean a huge explosion of color and noise and sparkle. And by the First World War, Brocks benefit was frequently used in the newspaper reports of what was going on at the front. Soldiers would often refer to a real Brocks benefit of a barrage or whatever it was to mean that. The last time I saw it used was in a leading article in the Daily Telegraph in the 70s, where the leading writer said that Michael Heseltine, who is quite a well-known British politician, would have to do more than his annual Brocks benefit at the Conservative Party conference if he was ever to be the leader of the party.
So all of this is by way of preface for the story of our main character, your grandfather, Frank Brock. And in the PR blurb for the book, I don't know if these are your words or those of an inspired publicist, but he is described as a remarkable combination of James Bond, Thomas Edison, Indiana Jones, and MacGyver. And we're going to talk about some of those things, but tell me just a little bit about Frank Brock that earns him that description.
Okay. Well, I'll run through him very briefly until we get into the war. So he goes to a school in South London near his home called Dulwich College, where, anyway, he goes there. And he, whilst there, he blew up the stove in his form room with an experiment which didn't go quite as he'd hoped. And the thing was, he was not caned by the headmaster, so his reputation in the school was secure after that, because the headmaster admired him, and probably also very relieved that he hadn't been killed in the explosion, I should think. So after he left school at 17 or 18, and he went straight into the family business, he went straight out to to help his father with the Delhi Durbar display, of coronation display in Delhi in 1903. And then in 1905, he ran a massive display for the Entente Cordiale. So the French fleet came to Portsmouth, a review of the fleets, and he put on a display with, I think, almost 60 ships and 6,000 men. And it's thought that it's possible he was spotted at that stage by the Navy, because after that he began to work on things like smokes, screening smokes and that sort of thing. And then in get so many centuries this covers. In 1911, he ran the coronation displays for George V in Delhi. And then there was an attempted assassination of the Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, and Frank took the residue from the silver of the howdah on top of the elephant, and he analyzed the residue and found out which explosive had been used. And from that description, they were able to track down the would-be assassin. After that, he was back in Europe, and Brox used to do a lot of business with Germany. So he was moving around Germany quite a lot. And he presented himself as an American, because at that time it was thought the Americans would never be involved in any European war. He presented himself as an American at the Zeppelin Works on one of their open days, and was able to get in and have a look at the Zeppelin. You can see from the image on the front of the book, which came from a 1909 poster of the set piece in the center of the display, that exactly that one, that by 1908, H.G. Wells had published War in the Air. It coincided with some very belligerent remarks from Berlin about the way they were going to use Zeppelins, the new Zeppelin, to kill everybody. And that, linked with the growing militarism of Germany, had made the Brocks think about the Zeppelins. And Frank became very interested in them. That's why he went and had a good look at them, or as good a look as he could. And he began to form ideas from that moment onwards. When the war, do you want me to go on into the war?
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you, Harry, is how old is he at this point? I mean, he's already kind of involved in espionage, and he
was born in the summer of '84. So in the summer of 14, he would have been 30.
Okay. He's embarking on, and it's not as if he was like brought up in this. He just kind of all of a sudden.
I think the other interesting thing is this, that he was said by the people who wrote about him after the war, his commanding officers, said that there was almost nowhere in the world he hadn't been. So when he went there, he would have traveled with teams of men. So he would have been responsible for the men. He would have been responsible for the lives of the people looking at the fireworks, sometimes millions of people. He carried a big burden of responsibility on his shoulders from a young age. So I think that thing is quite critical when you're looking at him in the war. He would have approached several people that wrote about him saying when he came into a room, he's one of those people, woof, he comes into a room, everybody knows he's there. He's very enthusiastic. He carries people with him. They listen to him and they respect him. And I think that comes partly from the way that he ran these men from an early age.
So go ahead, Rick. Yeah.
Well, we get to the beginning of the war, and he is now, his military service is it's complicated. He ends up being in the Army, the Navy, and
Yes.
the RAF, I think, altogether. But he's basically in the Navy and Naval Air, and he gets involved with a raid to sort of attack the Zeppelins
Yes,
in their
yes.
lair in
He does.
1914. But what I think is sort of interesting first about this is that I knew that the Zeppelins had dropped some bombs on Britain in World War I, but I had no idea the extent of the effort, which was pretty major, or the extent of to which it terrified the British public and focused the attention of the British military on these Zeppelins. They were really concerned about Zeppelins bombing England, which they started to do a little later in the war. And so right away in 1914, our man Frank is out there trying to do something about this.
Yes, that's true. So he joined the Royal Artillery in the army just after war broke out, but he must have seen Murray Souter, who ran the RNAS immediately under Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty. So Murray Souter ran it, and Frank let him know of his interest in Zeppelins, and he let him know what he thought he could do about it. So Murray Souter then got permission from Churchill to run the first strategic bombing raids in history, and to go out and try to attack the Zeppelins at their base, in their nest, as Churchill said, in their hornet's nest. You don't go around looking after individual hornets. You go to the nest and try and destroy the whole lot. So Frank was transferred on a temporary basis into the Royal Navy, and he went with a really astonishingly eccentric character called Noel Pemberton Billings into Germany. What he did was he got married on the 24th of October in the morning. He had a glass of champers, and then in the afternoon he ran off to Paris, where the ambassador gave him some false papers together with those for Noel Pemberton Billing.
I just want to say to members of our audience, don't try this yourself. Okay?
Yeah.
This is not generally a good answer for a positive marriage experience.
And they drove down, and they tricked their way into Switzerland, and they drove along to a point immediately opposite Friedrichshafen. Friedrichshafen was the German Zeppelin works base on the northern coast of Lake Constance. So Frank and Pemberton Billings zipped along there, and they bribed a fisherman to take them over to Friedrichshafen, and Pemberton Billings went ashore. Frank was left to come back the next night and pick him up and make sure the fisherman came back to pick him up. Pemberton Billings went into Friedrichshafen, had a look around. He then went to a house he found empty and went to sleep. He was woken up when 3 German officers arrived back. Pemberton Billings grabbed hold of an ornamental lion from the mantelpiece, jumped out of the window, knocked out the officer's driver, and sped off to the coast in their car. Frank and the fisherman were waiting, heard the fusillade of shots that followed Pemberton Billings, and he jumped into the boat. They got back to Switzerland, and off they went to France. So they went to Belfort, which is really the bottom of the line that was the static line that was built in the war between Germany and the Allies. and there was a huge airship, a hangar there, and Murray Suter gave Frank the job of moving 4 Avro aircraft to the thing. They didn't. The French were terrified that the Germans would then come back and punish them for allowing the raid to take place. Remember, this is the first strategic bombing raid. So the crates, the aircraft were crated up, flat packs, as Ian Gardner said in his Flat Pack Bombers book, and they were moved across by rail to Balfour and reassembled by some British engineers there. 3 of them managed to get off the ground. They flew with no maps. And in at least one case, the pilot had never flown this airplane before. Just amazing. And the joystick was always trying to get to one side. So they devised a plan where they lashed it to the side of the airplane with thick bands of rubber to try to take the pressure off the pilot's thing. Anyway, they weren't allowed maps because the French were worried that the Germans seeing the map would. So the pilots had to memorize this trip, which was quite a decent trip. I mean, 100 and something miles, and off they went. 1 pilot was shot down. 2 of them got back. They didn't do a great deal of damage, as far as I understand it. But the propaganda value was huge. It went right the way around the world as the British giving the Germans a bloody nose. And when they got back to London, Frank was introduced to Churchill, and Churchill and Murray Suter decided, well, he asked to be moved into the RNAS, and Churchill and Murray Suter decided that he should, they told him he had to create a secret research establishment in East London, in Stratford, not far from the Olympic Stadium, and he was to build it, design it, commission it, and command it. And that's what he did. And I suspect he probably used the experience of his father, who 13 years earlier had moved Brock's into a state-of-the-art, largest firework factory in the world in Sutton in South London. And he would have probably used his experience, I should think, because there was probably no one better at it in the world. And he built his thing there in East London, and that would have, yeah. So that's
so pretty much. I mean, what I accomplished by 30.
Spy, forensic scientist, inventor. Yeah.
Meet with Churchill. Make a contribution to the war effort. What do you do for an encore? Don't worry, it's Frank Brock.
We're not there yet. Well, I mean, one of the things I think people have tended to forget is just how terrifying the Zeppelins were. I mean, and when they first start attacking London, there's really no defense against them. So the problem that Frank has got to deal with is, how are we going to stop these? I wanted to read a quote. This is from a New York Times article at the time. And it's from an American reporter in London. And he says, among the autumn stars float a long, gaunt Zeppelin. It is dull yellow, the color of the harvest moon. The long fingers of searchlights, reaching up from the roofs of the city, are touching all the sides of the death messenger with their white tips. Great booming sounds shake the city. They are Zeppelin bombs, falling, killing, burning. Suddenly you realize that the biggest city in the world has become the night battlefield in which 7 million harmless men, women, and children live. I mean, this was a shocking thing.
Shocking.
And kind of talk about a little bit about the urgency of this and the problem that Frank is trying to solve.
Okay. Well, I mean, cities have been put under siege before, and artillery had dropped shells onto them, but they'd never. Then you couldn't see your enemy. Here, these great things were floating around above you, and you couldn't. There was absolutely nothing you could do. So the whole concept of being bombed from the air was very, very frightening. And then it was very frustrating. I mean, funnily enough, I sort of see some of the current frustrations with the virus in this. You know, you see the thing and you know what you're doing, but you just can't get anybody to do it. And the aeroplanes would take an hour to climb up to the height of a Zeppelin. It would take them an hour of solid climbing to get to the height of a Zeppelin. So they didn't have any. They didn't have radio. They didn't have radar. How were they going to find their aerodrome to land, their airfield to land when they'd done it? They didn't have any bullet to hit the Zeppelin because the Zeppelins carried sailmakers in their crew. So if a bullet went through a Zeppelin, the sailmaker would just go along and sew it up, so that it wouldn't make any difference. So
I thought that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Harry, but I thought when I was, after reading your book and going online and looking at stuff, I think it's important when people are thinking about this, that if you think about the Zeppelin, I always thought that big cigar shape was all filled, as one giant bag of gas. But it isn't. It's a bunch of different bags of gas inside there. And the crewmen can actually go up inside that superstructure to walk around and repair them. So they've really got that ability to foil somebody who's just shooting a regular bullet at them, trying to shoot them down.
Yeah, there were 18 huge cells of gas, individual cells of gas. And I can't remember if it was each Zeppelin took 250,000 guts of Argentinian cows, or whether it was each cell. But it was a lot of cows anyway. Made the gas bag.
There's a lot of cow guts there.
Yeah.
And so the point is, hydrogen. Everybody thinks hydrogen's easy to set hydrogen on fire, but actually it's not. Particularly, you have to have the right mix of oxygen and hydrogen, of air and hydrogen. And there were two bullets knocking around at that time. One was by a New Zealand inventor called Pomeroy, which only exploded when it hit something solid. And the great majority of the Zeppelin was not solid inside. There were girders, aluminium girders, but there weren't very many of them. So the second bullet was a Buckingham, another inventor called Buckingham. And the Buckingham bullet was really a tracer bullet and had really spent its fire by the time it got anywhere near the Zeppelin, unless the pilot got so close to the Zeppelin that the machine guns on the Zeppelin would have destroyed his airplane. So what he wanted was a bullet you could fire at it from a long way away, and when it hit the thing, it would bring it down. And we didn't have that. So that's what Frank put his mind to. And from the moment I think he saw it in his spying exercise, the idea in his head was of a matchbox principle. He thought that if he designed a bullet which worked like a match on a matchbox as it went through the material, that would create the sort of mix of hydrogen and air, which would be a very explosive mixture. So that's what he worked on.
And so now I want to be clear here. So he comes up with this bullet. It's
the Brock bullet.
The Brock bullet springs from him. It's produced. There's this threat. People are terrified. London is being bombarded, and largely because of this bullet, it stops. Right?
Yeah.
You mentioned 115 Zeppelins are in service. 77 of them are shot down.
Yeah.
And it just stops. It just stops.
Yeah. I think the thing is, when you read the book, we go into the psychology of the German Zeppelin crews, and until the night Frank's bullet was used, and the very first night it was used in September 1916, the first Zeppelin came down, and yes, so you can see how huge they are. I mean, they were absolutely much bigger than a jumbo jet. They were absolutely massive. So from that moment, the German crews are no longer so comfortable, nor the people sending them into action. And although they did, a few more did try and come over, the big scare from the Zeppelins was ended that night, really, because as soon as one is destroyed, it's no longer invincible.
All right. So okay, so let's just kind of keep track of this, then I'll turn it over to you, Rick. So the war starts. He's been a forensic scientist, a spy, a pilot, an engineer, and an inventor. It's 1916, but we're not done yet.
He's 32.
No.
He's 32.
He's 32.
So
and he's just had a couple of children. Here's
yeah, there's
Frank.
that too.
No, well, he's had one.
He's had one.
That's my mother. Yeah.
So what's the next problem?
So the next problem is he says to his brother-in-law, i.e., my grandmother's brother, "Well, I've dealt with the with the Zeppelins, and now I'm going to do for the submarines," because the submarines were a problem in 1916. The Battle of Jutland had taken place, which we didn't feel had gone frightfully well, but the German commanders went to the Kaiser and they said, "Look here, there is no way we can ever destroy the Royal Navy. We have to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare." And he gave his permission. And so submarines, which had been a problem, and then they stopped unrestricted, and then they brought it back on again. I don't know if it was late 16 or 17, but it was a problem. But at that time, he was beginning to get very close to a guy called Jackie Fisher, who is said to be the second most important naval officer behind Nelson ever to have been commissioned. And this is a man who probably all your expert watchers will know, but he'd modernized the Royal Navy and changed it from when he joined it, when it was muzzle-loaded timber ships, some of them, to an oil-powered dreadnoughts. He was the guy who built the dreadnoughts. So he worked very closely with Jackie Fisher. After Fisher resigned, after the Gallipoli problems, and he and Churchill resigned, Balfour, who took over from Churchill, asked Fisher to set up the Board of Invention and Research, the BIR, for the Admiralty. And this was partly to deal with the thousands of people who thought that they had the best way of defeating Germany. And they wanted somehow or other to give this idea to the government. And so the BIR's job was to handle all these incoming ideas and sort them out and see if any were any good, and to write to the people to show that they would, thank them for their idea, that sort of thing. That was part of it. But the main part was to orchestrate the scientific response from Britain. And so that all the top scientists were used, and quite a lot of the things that the BIR developed would then go on to be used in the Second World War, like ASDIC and so on. But he worked for Fisher. He went to Paris. He went on a long trip to Paris. He went through all the research stuff with the French research people. He came back with lots of ideas, and he worked on those, some of them, and produced his own things from ideas that were generated in Paris. The color filters, for example, he worked on. What he discovered was that if you use glass of a certain color, you could see through meteorological conditions which were impossible to see through. So pilots would come back with their pictures that they'd taken, the aerial reconnaissance pictures. They thought that they were flying in perfectly clear weather, but because of the meteorological conditions, when they were developed, the films showed nothing. It was just a mist. So there was that sort of thing. He thought that probably in the clear waters of the Mediterranean, where submarines were beginning to get a big problem by the later stages of the war, you could actually see through the water to the submarine using these filters. And by sometime, I don't know when, but a film company, quite a well-known film company in the UK called Ilford Camera and Film, were given a big contract, and the whole of the Royal Navy was supplied with these things for their binoculars, for their goggles, and for their cameras. And so that was one of his things. He was working on prisms for signaling. And don't ask me what he was doing with it, because I haven't yet found out.
But also, you know, so he's working on things for the submarine threat, but in his spare time, you know, because, you know, that obviously that's not going to fill it all. He also comes up with the Brock immediate rocket, which you could argue is the very first air-to-air rocket invented by Frank Brock, and other things with flares. And he is this is a terrible analogy, but I'll leap for it anyway. He is like the Forrest Gump of inventors and warriors in Britain in World War II. He seems to have his hand in almost everything.
Yes, I mean, you imagine
unbelievable.
You're a pilot, a British pilot, and you're flying towards Britain across the Channel, and you don't have a radio. You don't really have a way of telling the people on the ground that you are British, that you're a friend. So we began to shoot down some of our own airplanes. And Frank devised a system where the pilot could drop a flare down the side of his airplane. And as it went down, it worked again, a bit like the...
Can you hear me?
I'm back.
Yes, we had a little blip there.
Sorry.
So we're gonna pick it up with you're a flyer. You're flying over the ocean.
Can you see me? I lost you then. Yeah, you're back.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we had a little blip there. You were just saying that Frank had developed a system for pilots to identify themselves.
Yes. Yeah. So and also hundreds of his signal cartridges, colored signal cartridges, were fired. He was always off to the trenches. He wasn't just working for the Navy, although it was a naval establishment. He was always off to the trenches trying to give them the latest invention, trying to help them. So he was a very busy fellow, and it's said that he quite often worked for periods of 36 hours and non-stop, which is a long time.
And you look at this picture of him is from 1918, and you compare it with the picture perhaps from before that we looked at, and he definitely seems to be aging here. That schedule is wearing him out a bit.
Yeah. And there's one taken in 1913, 1914, when he met my grandmother. I think they must have exchanged photographs. And he looks, 23, 24. And the difference in that just 4 years, he carried a lot, I think.
So now we've dealt with the Zeppelins. We've helped pilots. We've helped divert the U-boat threat in the Channel, but he's not done.
No, we haven't.
No.
We haven't quite got.
We haven't gotten to the last chapter.
All right.
So the U-boats. At the beginning of the war, the Germans took over Zeebrugge and Ostend, and Zeebrugge means Bruges on the sea, and into Zeebrugge went a series of canals and Ostend from Bruges. So the Germans used Bruges as a submarine base, lots of concrete pens which we couldn't get at, and then they came straight out of the canal into the sea at Zeebrugge, which was created by the Belgians about at the beginning of the century, with the longest seawall in the world, 1.5 miles long, curving seawall called the Mole, M-O-L-E, which comes from Latin for some reason. I don't quite know why. Anyway, the point about this, why it was so important, and this was the reason, that one of the main reasons that we fought the Battle of Passchendaele, to try to get around the behind the Germans and close off this thing, because by late 1917, the War Cabinet was being told that unless we could do something about stopping the Germans sinking our ships, we wouldn't be able to go on fighting in 1918. There wouldn't be any plans. There wouldn't be any point of having plans because we couldn't fight. So the submarine menace was really very, very important by late 1917, and the Navy was getting blamed for it. The Navy, like, I don't know about the other services, but there's quite a lot of antipathy in the top of the Navy between the leaders at the top of the Navy. The guy who ran Dover, the Dover Patrol, was called Bacon. And in Christmas 1917, Bacon was ejected, and in came Roger Keyes, who was as the new supremo of the Dover Patrol. And Keyes had run the submarines out of Harwich earlier, where Commodore Towett had been settled with his powerful destroyer fleet. And they had got on very well, and Frank got on very, very well with Com T, as he was known to everybody in the UK at that time. And I think probably Com T, in fact, Frank put together a plan to go into Zeebrugge with Com T, Commodore Towett. I can never pronounce his surname, but I think you know who I'm talking about. He presented it to the Admiralty, but he said it was Frank's plan, and that was about a year before the actual thing took place. So he would have probably recommended Frank to Keyes. Anyway, Frank went to see Keyes, or Keyes asked him, and he said, look, we've got to stop these submarines going down the channel. If they don't go down the channel, then they have to go from Heligoland Bight, which is the main German base hundreds of miles off to the north. And obviously, if a submarine can cut 200 or 300 miles off its journey, it can stay out at sea much longer. It can do a lot more damage. So Zeebrugge was very, very important to shut. And at some point in the late 1917, the War Committee said that there was no single event more important to them in anything than the closing of Zeebrugge. That was how important it was. So Keyes said to Frank, look, come and help me. And so what they did, there had been a barrage across the channel from Britain, from England to France, but Keyes relayed it. He relayed it, and he put down new deep minefields. And then he said to Frank, I want to light this thing from one end to the other. So they put drifters and trawlers, which the Royal Navy ran. I suppose they'd taken them over for the duration, and they put them across the net. So the problem was the net was kept up on buoys, and between the buoys it would sink down. So the German submarines would come along to the bottom, wait at the bottom of the net, float up to the top at night, and go over the dip between the buoys and steam off into the channel. So Frank devised these Dover flares, or they were sometimes called deck flares, which produced a light of 1,000,000 candela, and were put on drifters and trawlers right across the nets from England to France. And the Germans called it a light curtain. And I think, and almost the first night that those flares were alight, the first submarine went into the minefield. So they would panic, they would dive down, and then they would hit the newly laid mines. But it wasn't thought to be enough. Keyes, after the war, thought that 13 U-boats had been sunk in that way. It wasn't enough, we thought, because we were scared stiff. You know, the British people were now having to deal with rationing, which had been introduced in the early part of 18, and spirits were down. So the Keyes said, right, what we're going to do is we're going to block Zeebrugge. we're going to do a blocking operation, which no Royal Naval commander had ever achieved before. Nelson tried it twice and couldn't do it because a port worth blocking is a port very heavily defended. So all previous attempts to block had been sunk, the block ships, long before they got to the port. And so Frank was asked to do his original scheme, which he'd done with Conti, and to produce a new smoke screen. The Royal Navy had smoke screens, but they did not have any smoke screens that did not give away their position by flame at night. So he produced a new smoke screen, and it was based on using a substance which is used by diabetics for pretend sugar, saxin. And so that was what it was. But he was also, in order for this scheme to work, you can if you can produce that picture of the harbor at Zeebrugge, that one. So in order for this to work, the British would land on the mole and would divert the Germans in every way they could, whilst the block ships were nuzzling around the end of the mole and going into. You can see the beginning of the canal, which leads to Bruges at the bottom of the picture, and go and sink themselves there. So Frank produced a brilliant smoke screen. It went on to be used into the Second World War, and he produced loads of other bits and pieces, gizmos, huge flamethrowers, which could fire a flame 100 yards, to be put onto the main ship that was going to lead the task force, which was the Vindictive. There it is, and you can see Frank. There were two flamethrowers fore and aft, so you can see those two square metal boxes, and then the big mushroom thing is that was full of quick fire guns that Frank got hold of from his pals in the trench warfare department, and on the side you see all the ramps that were put there so that the men, the Royal Marines and the Blue Jackets, could swarm up and onto the mole.
And I just want to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no,
I'm not that sorry. Don't worry about it. But at the top there, the thing that is shooting out which is essentially a flamethrower, right at the very top, and those are mattresses that they put around it. Isn't that what you said?
No. So no, that's not the flamethrower.
Okay.
The flamethrower. You see at the back, there's a square box.
Oh, that's the flamethrower.
That's the flamethrower. Come on, Rick, get with the program.
And then at the front, there's a square box.
But what's
Did you have a picture of the flamethrower? Maybe it won't work on the.
I didn't bring that one in. You did send.
No. Don't worry.
It's my fault, not yours. I'll fall on my sword.
Reminds me of Game of Thrones, dragons, but So that was. There it is, heading off for Zeebrugge. My grandfather's on that ship.
Right, he didn't have to be there. Right?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
So when Keyes asked him, my grandfather was very, very keen on a German rangefinder, artillery rangefinder, which he believed was very much better than ours. And he was pretty sure there was one on the mole. And he'd said to quite a few people, including Sir William Pope, the Cambridge University professor of chemistry, that he was going to bring him back a rangefinder. And for a long time, he'd been concerned about this rangefinder because he wanted to improve the British gunnery. And so he said to Keyes, I will do everything you ask, provided you let me come on this raid. And it was something, and Keyes said yes, which was something that many people after the raid were not very pleased with him about. But anyway, that's where we were.
So I think again, for Americans to kind of get an idea of how desperate this is. Um, 11 Victoria Crosses are awarded for
Yeah,
this.
three for Austin. So the attack goes ahead, and Frank goes. But just before they get to the mole, the wind changes direction, blows away his smoke screen. They have to go hell for leather to get to the mole. They're blown up by every piece of artillery known to man, but Frank manages to get onto the mole. He leads a charge. He finds the rangefinder. Then he charges the guns. He attacks them with his fist, his cutlass, and his revolver. He was a brilliant shot with a revolver. And he sends the Germans running helter-skelter to get away from him. And then he goes on to try to put some demolition charges onto a German torpedo boat, which he's seen. He's interrupted there by a German sailor called Hermann Kuhne, and they have a sword fight, and they each kill each other with their last thrust, basically. A week after this, Fisher writes to a Liberal MP in which he says, I can't remember the words he used, but he is very, very upset, basically, about Frank's death. That's what he's saying. And in 1937, the Nazis, recognizing the significance of Frank's death, named a destroyer after Kuhne. So it's called the Hermann Kuhne destroyer, and it scuttled itself in a Norwegian fjord in World War II.
Good.
With a British boat at the neck of the fjord.
It's a tragic end, but it is pretty much part and parcel with the life that he lived.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a story that it's the kind of daring do story you expect out of youth fiction, and yet there it is. And your research is excellent, and you have all these first person accounts of other people on that mole in this desperate nighttime fighting on the mole, who talk about Frank and seeing him do all these things. It's not something made up or exaggerated. It's simply what this extraordinary person.
But you've got to remember that while this was going on, the motor launches, it was his idea that the smoke screen should be laid with motor launches whizzing backwards and forwards in front of the mole. That had never been done before. And while that was going on, there was smoke everywhere. There were artillery shells whistling everywhere. There were machine gun bullets everywhere. So the reports that came back were mixed. And it's only recently a Flemish historian who became absolutely fascinated by this battle, studied every minute and every square foot of the mole, and he has come to the conclusion that no other British officer could have had this sword fight, that it was only Frank. He's fluent in English and German. He was able to look at the archives of both nations, and he's seen quite a lot of the German accounts. And so what is in the book has come from that research as well. Johann.
And the ultimate impact of that raid, well, it's been argued about, is arguably it's quite destructive in the last months of the war to the German submarine effort.
Yes, the British people tended to take the German line of propaganda that it hadn't done any harm, but there is quite a lot of evidence that it did do a great deal more harm than was thought at the time. What it did do was boost the British morale and the Allied morale sky high, because the Germans were almost beating us in the Great Spring Offensive, and suddenly we came out with this audacious, brave, and successful scheme, which was plastered over every newspaper in the world for about a week, and it lifted morale. And we know what Napoleon said about morale. Morale is to the physical as 3 is to 1.
Well, Harry Smee, I can't thank you enough for joining us today and telling us about your extraordinary grandfather. We are so lucky that you have spent decades looking into his life and putting together the research behind the book Gunpowder and Glory, The Explosive Life of Frank Brock, OBE, which is Order of the British Empire, for those of you Americans who may not be familiar. And what an extraordinary hour it's been speaking with you.
Guys,
Thank you very much.
thank you, Harry. Check out the book. We have only scratched the surface of this person's amazing life. I mean, your jaws will just
I
drop.
hope it'll be a great Christmas present, a great birthday present to give to people.
I couldn't agree more.
Excellent. Harry, thank you again
Thank
for
you,
joining
Harry.
us. Well, that was another amazing, exciting
Yes.
show.
I mean, what a story. I mean, it's like, I don't know, young Indiana Jones.
It's
you know?
like something, Kipling would write, or John Buchan, the British writer who was writing all these extraordinary daring-do stories of World War I, and yet there it is, and there's the real thing, and it's absolutely fabulous. So we don't have a joke today or a
Nothing.
history happened here, so we're just going to say that next week we're back to World War II. And our guest is Chris Wallace, who has written a book called Countdown 1945, The Extraordinary Story of the Atomic Bomb and the 116 Days That Have Changed the World.
The biggest bang ever.
And until then, everybody enjoy the week, and thank you for joining us.
Stay safe, everybody.